Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with, and oh, I'm so happy about this, and you will be too, the Malcolm Arnold Centenary Edition on Naxos. This contains his 9 symphonies, an interview with the composer, and the most complete ever album of his famous English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish dances. In other words, you get all of them. And it's the only disc that has all of them, all 5 sets, or however many. See, 2 sets of English, a Scottish, 5 sets. And it's all marvelous. These performances, conducted by Andrew Penny with the National Symphony Orchestra of Ireland and the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, have been all neatly boxed up, reboxed up, actually. They showed up in an earlier box, which went out of print, but now they have a nice box. It's a nice, sturdy box, colorful box, and they have very well packaged material here. You get booklet notes in the booklet, and you have nice sturdy cardboard slipcases. It's really a class act. I said this before, Naxos boxes, if I drop them all over the place, really are very well made, relatively speaking, compared to like what most other labels are doing. They're very nicely done. And this is just a fantastic set. The composer was present at the recording sessions. The performances have his imprimatur, and boy, are they good. So let's talk a little about Malcolm Arnold, first of all. The centenary in question is the 100th anniversary of his birth in 2021. Maybe there will be some more Malcolm Arnold coming from some of the labels that have symphony cycles like Chandos. Maybe RCA/BMG/Conifer will reissue their big Malcolm Arnold box with Vernon Handley. But so far, there's nothing in sight. And we're coming to the end of 2021. So I think this is going to be it. And thank God it's such a good set. It's just marvelous. So he was born in 1921. He died in 2006, but he stopped composing about 1986. And the reason for that was because his life was actually really very, very tragic. He was, first of all, a difficult person to get along with. He began his life as a trumpeter in the London orchestras, like the LSO or the LPO or one of those orchestras. He was a trumpeter and a very good one. And when he became a composer, he was famous, most famous for, first of all, the English dances and also the film score to The Bridge on the River Kwai, which he wrote in 10 days and for which he won an Oscar. He did 150 film scores. There must be a ton of music out there that could be wrapped up in suites and dealt with in various ways. Some of it has been. He was extraordinary as a composer. He doesn't get credit for being that extraordinary as a composer for a lot of reasons. The first of which is that his style is extremely eclectic. It's a combination of popular music idioms, classical forms, and especially in the 50s and 60s, the height of the academic serial interruption in our musical history, the kind of thing that Malcolm Arnold was doing was going to be reviled by the critics and the press, and it largely was. And that's really a shame. But besides that, he was a terrible alcoholic, an inveterate womanizer. He tried to kill himself several times. He was manic depressive. And toward the 70s and sort of the 80s, his life went completely to pieces. He had to be institutionalized, and he had to have a conservator appointed to take care of him and to take care of his estate. He had no money. He was, he was being supported by the National Health Service. It was a mess. It was a mess. And the Ninth Symphony was his last serious work, his last big work. And after that, he wrote nothing for the remaining years of his life. But he lived long enough to get his health issues in order, and, more or less, and to see his music begin to receive some of the acclaim that it richly deserves, because he was a great, great composer. And the funny thing about it is that, people generally like composers who have miserable, tragic lives, and he really did. I mean, he had children. At least one of them, I think, was autistic. He had very, very difficult circumstances and personality issues. And usually that's good for art. And it was good for his art. It really was. But exactly how, it's sort of hard to say. I think part of the problem may be that there are too many people around who knew him. And so it's too easy to tie the music in with his biography. Particularly, even Andrew Penny here talks about the last symphonies as reflecting, his mental breakdown. And maybe it does. Certainly the style became more difficult while being recognizably his own. But that's what happens sometimes. I mean, it happened with Mahler. I mean, not that he had a mental breakdown, but I mean, his music became progressively more emotionally intense, and I think, more elegiac and more death obsessed. I mean, it happens to a lot of composers toward the end of their lives or after they've suffered hammer blows of fate, if we should quote the Mahlerian terminology. But really, that's what happened with Malcolm Arnold. And you would think that at least the sympathy would create some interest, because his symphonies, there are 9 of them, are a genuine symphonic cycle. In an instantly identifiable idiom, his music sounds like nobody else. You could always tell who wrote it, no matter how difficult or gnarly it got. And it really does evolve as it goes. It evolves in a singularly sad and depressing way, but it's an evolution nonetheless. And of course, as you know, sadness and depression can make great art, sometimes difficult art. But why not give him the benefit of the doubt? I mean, we have zillions of composers who wrote nothing but miserable and depressing music, and we think they're just terrific. There's no reason why Malcolm Arnold had to be, cheeky and jazz-laden his entire life. So this wonderful set, gives you an opportunity to hear his stylistic evolution, and we're going to hear it because I'm going to play you some samples, and hopefully that will give you some sense of, first of all, just what a distinctive composer he was, and then second of all, because he was so distinctive, you have the confidence to take on some of his later, more difficult pieces, knowing perfectly well who wrote them and what kind of a style it is. And I think they're taken as a whole. It's really almost as fine a cycle as any 20th century composer wrote. It's up there. You know what I mean? You don't have to make invidious comparisons to other composers, but I mean, this is really, really good stuff, personal stuff, and fascinating the more you listen to it. It really bears repetition. So let's talk about the Malcolm Arnold that people sort of expect, the finale of his Second Symphony. It's breezy, it's jolly, and it has a couple characteristics that I think we can define very, very easily after you've heard it. So here it is, the finale of Symphony Number 2. You get the popular music element, you get the wonderful writing for woodwinds, fabulous writing for woodwinds, and then you get, at the beginning of this sort of second subject that comes up, this hard dissonance, because his music is usually very melodic and very constant, except when it's not. But when he decides to be dissonant, he just goes for it. It's dissonant because he's just crunching the harmony in there, and it's marvelous the way he does it with such directness and such edge. His most admired composer, Malcolm Arnold always said, was Berlioz. And he is one of the really few composers, I think, whose orchestration really reflects Berlioz's. That is, that brightness, that clarity, the emphasis on woodwind sonorities, often at the expense of the strings. You very seldom hear with Arnold sort of a rich, plush cushion of strings supporting the other instruments. You don't. He treats each section of the orchestra independently and will do anything for them at any point. And he doesn't resort to the strings for their usual sort of, the orchestra is the string section and everything else is on top of it. That's not how he writes, and he was a brass player. So his brass parts are just extraordinary. You hear that kind of clarity and those bright unblended colors just the way you do with Berlioz. And you hear it in the Second Symphony in that particular moment. It's just marvelous. And so after that, he did the Third Symphony, and obviously, since there are 9 of them. But the Third Symphony is also a very, very interesting and intriguing work because it's written for standard symphony orchestra with no percussion. And I always think the measure of a great composer is their ability to write for standard symphony orchestra with no percussion, besides timpani, that is, nothing extra, no extra coloristic devices. Can they really just put the music together and make the orchestration sound marvelous? And Arnold can. Another composer who could do that was George Lloyd. His Second Symphony is sort of similar to the Malcolm Arnold Third. And Vaughan Williams, the Fifth Symphony, another symphony for small orchestra with no extra instruments that sounds completely characteristic of its composer. It's a good way to see if the guy really is as original in terms of the sonic concept as we think they are, is to listen to a piece like that. And the third really brings home the bacon. And then the fourth was written after the race riots around 1960-ish, and it uses Latin percussion, as Arnold is somehow influenced by the fact that one of the races in question was the Commonwealth, the Jamaican steel drum set. And so you hear some of that sort of percolating through the Fourth Symphony, but it's one of his most profound works. And then comes the Fifth, which is really one of the symphonies that everybody got to know him by because there was a wonderful EMI recording with, I think it was Charles Groves, who recorded it. It may have been Malcolm Arnold himself, but it was on EMI. And it was first class. And I played a bit of the scherzo of this symphony for you when we had our abstract melody, concrete images, because I said it sounded like shopping. And that's what most of you sort of agreed with me. I was very happy about that. But I want to play you the opening of the Fifth Symphony, which has some extraordinary use of timbre. And I think it gives you a sense of just how special his handling of the orchestra was, because you will not hear a second subject like this in any other symphony. So here's the opening of Symphony No. 5. Note also the contrast between the dissonance of that opening idea and just the directly dissonant. It's like, here, take this, jabbing at you. And then this wonderful, magical, totally consonant, beautiful diatonic second subject scored for, harp and celesta, glockenspiel. And Arnold gets all of these effects without using a terribly large orchestra. Usually he just has double winds and a couple percussionists. They play a lot of instruments. But he just gets this extraordinary range of sound. So symphonies 4, 5, and 6 are sort of a group, sort of the middle group. And the last group is 7, 8, and 9, where his idiom begins to become a lot more disturbed, and a lot harsher and somewhat spookier, and, some would say more emotionally deep. I don't think that's ever fair, because I think happiness has depth. And Malcolm Arnold's happiness has a lot of depth in his earlier works, and so does his sadness. And, it can be very, very touching in these earlier works. But in these late works, they are mostly troubled and dark. And, you just have to get used to them, because it's the same guy. And that's the point. I want to play you a bit of the slow movement of Symphony Number 8, which you will hear some of the same sort of magic instruments that you heard in the Fifth Symphony. But now the entire mood is far, far darker. Here is a bit of the slow movement of Symphony Number 8. Finally, last but not least, we come to Symphony Number 9, which has 3 short movements and then a big, long, sparse, very controversial concluding adagio. Some people think it's incredibly moving. It's been compared to the final adagio of Mahler's Ninth, or the concluding movement, probably more appropriately, of Shostakovich's 15th. It has some of that same desolation and sparseness, and that last second suggestion of major chord tranquility at the very, very end. Some people think it's just, the barren work of a deranged mind. Time will tell. But I would like to play you the third movement, which is more jubiloso, jubilant, which it really doesn't sound that to me. But you will hear, I think, it's remarkably similar to that opening, the finale, of the Second Symphony that we heard right at the beginning of this chat. Only it's that gone wrong. It's the same composer, it's the same style, some of the same gestures, but everything about it sounds bitter and upset. It's almost like the Rondo Burlesque from Mahler's Ninth. There's a harshness and hostility, and the gestures of supposed joy and celebration, they don't sound particularly sincere. I think the music is really almost mocking in its false sense of jubilation. So here is the third movement of Symphony Number 9. See what I mean? I think you heard that pretty clearly. In any case, this is just a taste of Malcolm Arnold's 9 symphonies. And like I said, you get all 9 symphonies, plus you get the dances on a separate disc, which are splendidly done. And the whole set is marvelous. And this is really a composer who deserves to be taken seriously, even though a lot of his music is humorous. Humorous in a way that few music has been since Haydn, but he really had a fabulous sense of humor as well. And, Naxos has quite a few more Malcolm Arnold discs, and I kind of wish they'd done a bigger box and just stuffed everything in one box, but at least we have this, and the price is really good, and the production values are the highest quality, and you're just not going to do better. So give Malcolm Arnold a shot. This is a wonderful, wonderful chance to get to know this splendid composer who's ripe for revaluation and for, I think, a new respect for his creative impulse, which was really amazing. Absolutely amazing. Keep on listening, folks. Thanks for joining me. Take care.